Good evening. Welcome to the April 2026 presentation by the Bay Area Culinary Historians. Tonight, we are pleased to have Evelyn Rose join us to speak on What Mrs. Fisher Knew and What We Know Now, rediscovering the life of cookbook author and entrepreneur Abby Fisher. Evelyn Rose has been a community historian in San Francisco for nearly 20 years. After launching her history blog, Tramps of San Francisco, in 2012, to rediscover some of the forgotten histories of the city by the bay, in 2014 she founded the Glen Park Neighborhoods History Project and subsequently rediscovered several historic firsts in her district. Evelyn continues to research the life histories of Abby and Alexander Fisher, who resided just over the hill from Glen Park in Noe Valley. She published a preliminary summary of her research in Repast, a publication of the Culinary Historians of Ann Arbor, in winter 2022. Please join us in welcoming Evelyn Rose.
Thank you, Andrew. And I'm just thrilled to be here tonight with Bay Area Culinary Historians. And I thank everyone for taking time from your late Sunday afternoon, Sunday evening to spend some time with us. So why don't we go ahead and dive in? As you know, Mrs. Fisher knew a lot about old Southern cooking, but what we know about her really hasn't been that much. And so I hope that we can bring some of those unknown facts to the surface this evening. And okay, let's advance now. This worked a moment ago. There we go. So how did I come across Abby Fisher? Well, in Glen Park in San Francisco, which is about 5 miles from downtown, if you know Twin Peaks in San Francisco and the big red and white Sutro radio tower, we're just south of there. And in our neighborhood, it was believed that Mary Ellen Pleasant, the mother of California civil rights, had actually lived in a very Gothic style home and towards the end of her life. And I was able to confirm and debunk that actually, no, that wasn't true. That the house had been purchased by an associate of hers 2 years after she died. But while I was doing that research, I came across Tricia Wagner's book, African Women of the Old West. And in that book, Mary Ellen Pleasant is mentioned. And then I just happened to come across Abby Fisher, and I saw that she had lived in San Francisco, and then saw that she had lived in Noe Valley. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's just over the hill. I have to learn more about her. And that was probably in 2018, 2019. It was a couple of years before we could really begin the research. But I hope tonight you'll enjoy some of the things that I've found. So as you know, Mrs. Fisher published her book in San Francisco in 1881. The publishers were the Women's Cooperative Printing Office. They had been in business since about 1864, all women, and I love their ad that says, women set type, women run presses, as if they had to prove that, yes, women can do this too. These are some examples of the beautiful covers that they created for Mrs. Fisher's book. And we can see it was multicolored, had gold gilt on the front. This is a particularly good condition here, and just an extraordinary cover. And so this went to print in 1881, and it was popular for a while, as we'll see later on. And then it was generally forgotten by the turn of the 20th century until it showed up again in Sotheby's auction in 1984 in the Marcus and Elizabeth Graham collection. Residents of Los Angeles, they've been collecting cookbooks for quite a while, and collected over 600 that covered 500 years of culinary history. And the Sotheby's catalog states only about Mrs. Fisher's book that she was an illiterate ex-slave who dictated her recipes. So what did she share about herself in her book? And she shared that she was late of Mobile, Alabama. She apologized for her inability to read and write. and her husband also having been without the advantages of an education, upon whom, though, would devolve the writing of the book at my dictation. So we can picture Mrs. Fisher in her uh, professional kitchen with her husband, Alexander, writing madly as she's calling out these recipes and every step that she's taking. It would definitely be something to have seen because she's probably got several recipes going at the same time. She doubted whether she could present a work that would give perfect satisfaction, but she was encouraged by her lady friends and patrons who she listed there on her preface and apology page. She furthered that she had 35 years in the art of cooking. We'll talk about that a little bit later as well. And the book was intended to be a complete instructor so that a child can understand it and learn the art of cooking. Now, Dr. Zafar, who has written about Mrs. Fisher, believes that that particular statement was really directed to very wealthy white women who didn't spend a lot of time in the kitchen. And that when this book came out, that, if a child can do it, then certainly these wealthy white women can do it as well. And lastly, she shares towards the end of the book that she had given birth to 11 children and raised them all. And we'll talk about that a little bit at the end as well. Now, as far as her friends and patrons, looking into who they were and diving into this, I'm trying to find connections of between Mobile and San Francisco. As we'll see, she was associated, and her husband were associated with some rather prominent people. And so I've been trying to track down where did this network, connect? Because she had the Mobile, Alabama network, the San Francisco network, and probably some origins in South Carolina, Georgia, which I'll talk about. And it's like, what was the connection that brought them to San Francisco ultimately in early 1877? So we see here of the various folks who are listed, definitely very prominent and wealthy people. That couple of folks in insurance, couple of stockbrokers, a gentleman in charge of Empire Brewery, Mrs. Glasscock, who I couldn't find a lot about, but that she was born in South Carolina. Another woman who ran a fashionable boarding house, a millionaire grocer, and an attorney. So these folks are reflective of the people that Mrs. Fisher was catering to in terms of delivering meals, preparing meals for them. So at the Sotheby's auction in 1984, it's, as you probably know, Karen Hess who discovered her book. She states in another recollection that, she didn't have the money at the time to purchase the book, and that she didn't even really get to get her hands on the book. But after the auction, she did finally retrieve a copy for herself. And she found that her recipes were more reflective of origins in South Carolina, not Alabama, and that she had referred to plantation in 3 of her recipes. So she surmised that Mrs. Fisher had actually learned to cook on a plantation and not an urban kitchen. And that by the time she published the book, she had truly mastered the art of cooking on the range. And she particularly calls out how she could roast meats in the iron box. She had definitely mastered that. And Ms. Hess surmised that coming west, she could have been a cook on a wagon train. It's just not it's not inconceivable. So we're going to look at a few of these facts and assumptions and see what a little bit more research can reveal about them. So first of all, we didn't know much about Mrs. Fisher other than what she had put in her preface, and also what's available in mainly federal census records and city directories. And as I was beginning my research, I came across this article in the San Francisco Examiner that was published in 1881 that really opened the gates for me into this whole presentation that I'm going to share with you. And in this book, her book has been published, and the Examiner says, you know, an excellent cookery book. Mrs. Fisher, a colored cook from the South, raised in the family of the late Newton St. John of Mobile, Alabama. And then we'll talk about what that means in a bit. That she just published her book on all kinds of soups, terrapin stews, cornbread pastry, sweet and plain pickles, mangoes, in fact, everything in the cooking, jelly, preserve, pickle line calculated to make a family happy. Everybody ought to have the book. It's simple and plain and easy to understand, and it can be had at Mrs. Fisher's number 202 DuPont Street, which is Grant Street in San Francisco today, at $1.50 a copy. Well, in 1881, that $1.50 would be worth $50, $50 today. So clearly she was publishing the book for the upper classes. And the writer goes on to say that the book reflects credit upon her, the publisher, and shows what our Southern colored people can and will do. Seems like that wouldn't be necessary to say, but they did. And so let housekeepers from every part of the country send for a copy of the book, and how she had won 3 prizes from as many different fairs for her pickles, sauces, blackberry brandy, preserves, etc. So who was Newton St. John? Well, this is an image of him, and he was actually a native of New York. And by 1837, he was in Mobile, Alabama, working as a clerk at a merchants and tailors business. But later on, he would establish what became known as the popular banking house of St. John Powers and Company of Mobile. Now, their main business may not be surprising in Mobile, Alabama, you know, right there on the Gulf of Mexico, was cotton. Cotton was driving the economy of the South. And that was the main business that he was involved in, was shipping cotton by land and sea to the north, elsewhere in the South, and also over to London, where it was distributed further into Europe. And he had become an agent for Baring Brothers in London, which is the same company that helped the United States finance the Louisiana Purchase. So, you know, this is a very prominent gentleman who's working with major industries, both here and abroad. And he was a very active member of the Whig Party, which, when we get to the period of the Civil War, the Whigs did not want secession to happen. They were against secession, but they still believed that it was necessary to have slavery. And when he was growing up in New York, slavery was still legal when he was a child. So it wasn't something he just adopted when he moved to Alabama, but it was something he had grown up with and was familiar with it. So he was also the director of the board of directors of the Mobile and Ohio Railroad, which was co-organized by Stephen A. Douglas, the senator from Illinois, the same senator that ran against President Lincoln for the presidency in 1860. So already we are with some very top-tier financiers and politicians. And these are the people that Mrs. Fisher would be cooking for once she became, fully in charge of the kitchen. In addition, St. John was president of a life insurance and trust, and in his obituary that was shared throughout the country in multiple newspapers, his career had been intimately associated with the past of Mobile, meaning pre-Civil War. And his combined value just at the start of the Civil War, it was $390,000, which today would be $14.2 million. And when you think of people like Elon Musk who are trillionaires and all the billionaires that are around now, it may seem like a paltry sum, but in actuality, that was quite a bit of money for that time period. So an extremely wealthy man. So how did Mrs. Fisher come into the Newton St. John family in which she said she was raised? So with some research, I'm going to share with you here what I believe could have been how she got from South Carolina, where as she stated she was born, to Mobile. And we're going to be talking about Petersburg, Georgia. And it was initially settled and after the Revolutionary War, located at the Savannah and Broad Rivers in Georgia. Savannah River is the state line between South Carolina and Georgia. And so a lot of American Revolution veterans were being granted massive pieces of land in the South. And that is how the South began to be populated towards the end of the 18th century. It's located in what's called the Southern Piedmont. Today, Petersburg is actually under a reservoir called Clark's Hill Lake. But when it was still an active community, it was considered to have traditional low country cuisine that combined European, African, and indigenous American influences. And it also included the Gullah Geechee foodways from that region. Now we're going to, in this historic marker, as you read through it, some of the early settlers were William Wyatt Bibb. And so we are going to explore the Bibb family here for a moment. So the Bibbs were originally from Virginia, and we see Captain William Bibb, who had been a veteran of the Revolutionary War. He married Sarah Smith Wyatt, also of Virginia. And together they had three children: William Wyatt Bibb, who was mentioned in the historic marker, Dorothy Bibb, a daughter, and Thomas Bibb. So also from the north, from Delaware, were the Popes. And Lieutenant Colonel Charles Pope, another veteran from the war who was granted land around Petersburg, he married a Jane Stokesley. Together, they had a son, Alexander Pope, who was born in 1777 in Mount Pleasant, Wilkes County, Georgia, which was just across the Broad River from Petersburg. And from what I've read, it appears that Alexander Pope was born on the same plantation where the cotton gin was innovated. So this is the heart of cotton country. Now, Alexander Pope married Dorothy Bibb, and together, well, before I get there, what would happen is that now they've come to Georgia, and the Indians, the Cherokee, and the Creek have been defeated in Georgia. The Indian wars then west of them in Alabama with the Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and the Alabamai, they were being defeated as well. So now all of this land is opening up in Alabama. So we see in 1818 that Alexander Pope is appointed by President John Quincy Adams to be the Registrar of the Land Office in Alabama. And when they get to Alabama, also the Bibbs go, and you see there that William Wyatt Bibb actually becomes the very first governor of Alabama. And when he dies in office, his brother Thomas becomes the second governor. So again, this is the center of politics in Georgia and Alabama. Now, between Alexander Pope and Dorothy Bibb, they have a daughter, Maria Jane Pope, and she married Newton St. John. They probably met in Mobile. They were married in Petersburg in 1835. So I believe that when you look at the slave records for Alexander Pope, he owned hundreds of slaves. He had multiple plantations in multiple areas in Georgia and in Alabama. So he probably totally, when you look at the grand total, hundreds of slaves that he owned. And I believe that it's possible that Mrs. Fisher's mother may have at one point been transferred, sold from her original family, which I'll point out in a couple of slides, to the Pope family. And that perhaps when Alexander Pope, when his daughter married Newton St. John, it could be that that is when Mrs. Fisher arrived in Mobile. So let's look at that a little bit more here. So, as we recall, Karen Hess said, that she had learned to cook on a plantation, not an urban kitchen. Well, if we look at Mobile today, where the arrow is pointing is where Newton St. John lived in Mobile. And this route here is Interstate 10. And before I started researching Abby Fisher, I'd driven through Mobile several times along I-10. You go into a tunnel, you come up, and you head over to the panhandle of Florida. Had no idea how close that I was passing to what would be Mrs. Fisher's house. Since I started researching, I haven't been back to Mobile, and I can't wait to get back there. But if we look then at a Sanborn insurance map. Now, Sanborn insurance maps first started to be published right about this time in 1885. And the purpose was if there's a fire, at least there's a recording of the types of buildings that were in the area, how big they were, what they were constructive of, what were some of their special features. And these were being drawn in cities across the country. And so it's really helpful to go back to look at, particularly here in San Francisco too, to look at, what are some of these historic residences? What did the neighborhoods look like back at the time that we're researching? So what I just showed you then, I-10 would be pretty much running east-west along here. And we see here that in 1861, Newton St. John was living at the corner of Church Street and St. Emmanuel, right across the street from an Episcopal church called Christ Church. His offices were actually at the Battle House Hotel, just a couple of blocks away in downtown Mobile. Now, I mentioned that Stephen Douglas, had co-developed the Mobile and Ohio Railroad. Well, I recently found that when Douglas heard that he had lost the election to Lincoln, he was at the Battle House Hotel. So you just have to wonder, was Newton St. John with him? Was Mrs. Fisher perhaps serving them a meal? What was she experiencing at that time? And then after the war, Newton St. John is living a little bit further away. Just 6 or 8 blocks away from the Newton St. John house was John Ragland's Slave Mart. Now, it must have been incredibly difficult for Abby and her husband Alexander, as they're making their way around town, to pass by this location. Today, this is a site of memory. It's commemorated and designated as a memorial site by UNESCO. So it's a very important location to recall the slave mart there, and that something like that should never happen again. So if we look now a little more closely in later pages of the Sanborn insurance record, it goes into deeper detail of what these houses were composed of. And here, for instance, this is a 2-story house with a steel chimney, and it's got a little bit of a porch here. These are dwellings. Here is what the DWGS stands for, a 3-story house. This seems to be an 8-foot wall with an empty field. And here we see we're on Church Street, and Saint Emmanuel. So I was able to contact a gentleman who at the time was president of the Church Street East Neighborhood Association. This is the location that the house was located. It's the oldest neighborhood in Mobile. And with a little bit more research, he helped me confirm that this house in this picture, and this is from 1840, was the Newton St. John house. So this is the house where during her time in Mobile, Abby would have been working as a cook and perhaps her mother as well. And we'll get back to the family history in a little bit. This is Christ Church here. You see here, there's kind of an empty lot here. There is a gate. There's a couple of trees growing. Um, we know that here in San Francisco, Mrs. Fisher had a large garden. I wonder if this could have been a garden that she was keeping for the household. Now, today, unfortunately, this house is no longer there. Today, this area is called Mardi Gras Park. This is part of City Hall and also the Mobile History Center. But this tree, here we are at the corner of Church and St. Emmanuel. Here's Christ Church, still active church. This tree we may see here as a young sapling all these years later. So unfortunately, her house, for whatever reason, my contact in Mobile was not able to find any information about what may have happened to the house or when it may have been demolished. So in terms of her upwards of 35 years in the art of cooking, you know, Karen Hess refers to what, she calls the iron monster. I kind of liken it to a Wurlitzer organ, kind of like if you're in San Francisco at the Castro Theater, that Grieg, kind of arching organ that's got multiple keyboards and multiple foot pedals. And, there's a lot happening when you're playing on the Wurlitzer. And to me, and this example of an iron monster is from a hotel in Sonoma, about 70 miles or so north of San Francisco. And you can see everything that has to happen here. You've got the wood, you have to know how to vent it and how to manage that temperature. When Karen Hess referred to Mrs. Fisher's ability to roast meats, that's all happening in these iron boxes. It looks extremely complicated. So that would be an example of probably what she was using at the Newton St. John house, as opposed to a hearth that I think in the previous image here, that would have been more likely to have been used on a plantation prior to the Civil War. So her home then, so here we are again at church at St. Emmanuel. Here she was only a block away from what was known as the Southern Market. So it wasn't a long walk to go get, whatever groceries she needed that she couldn't grow perhaps in her open garden. It was just a few steps to get to the public market. And here we see it's very close to Mobile Bay and the river. These rails are going to the wharves where cotton and other goods are being shipped and received. So this is actually a very, very busy commerce area in which Mrs. Fisher and the Newton St. John family are living. So here's an image of the Southern Market, and it was full of stalls. So it wasn't like, as you know, the modern groceries really came about after the turn of the 20th century. So these were individual stalls. That there were meat stalls, fish stalls, game and poultry stalls, vegetables. They had coffee stands. And then there were some other markets that had additional meat and vegetable stalls. So there were certainly many options for Mrs. Fisher, and I often wonder, could she have had a stall? It's possible. I would think with Newton St. John, it would give her some permission in antebellum South to be more present in white dominated spaces. So it's possible that, she began her entrepreneurship here in Mobile at the Southern Market. So Robert Brower, who's a member of Bay Area Culinary Historians, back in 2007 published and repassed his research about the origins of Mrs. Fisher and that her mother's maiden name had been Andrews. And he did some deep research, genealogical research, and determined that the only candidate would have been a James Andrews in Orangeburg, South Carolina. And there are times in census records where Mrs. Fisher mentions that her father was from France. And, Mr. Brower assumes that it's, because they were speaking French. Well, there's also in this area a heavy population of Huguenots who were also very fluent in French. And so it's very possible that she was hearing French from folks who were not necessarily from France, but had been born in South Carolina, but had French as an additional language. Then, when Mrs. Fisher marries Alexander Fisher later on in 1860, her maiden name is Clifton. He mentions he married Abby Clifton. And it turns out her mother's name was Abby Clifton. So I did a little searching for some Cliftons in South Carolina. There's some possibilities in Charleston, down on St. Helena Sound, and up in shoot, can't think of the name, and I've covered it up, but up where the state capitol was, as well. So it could be that in her life journey, at some point, she and her mother married someone from one of these Clifton plantations, or, was transferred by sale to a Clifton family and adopted the name Clifton. Then we have the Bibbs and Popes arriving in Petersburg. So not too far away. This is about, I think, about 130 miles or something distance between Orangeburg and Peterson. So certainly there is not too far to travel for Abby and her mother. In addition, in Petersburg, there was another huge slave market. So it was one of the largest slave markets in the South. And if there had been a transfer at some point from either the Andrews and or the Cliftons into the Popes, then it probably would have happened there. Again, this is all assumption. Now I'm going to call out Milledgeville because this was the capital of Georgia at the time. So this is the political center of the South. This particular road goes straight to Washington, D.C. We know that the Bibbs and Popes were traveling frequently back and forth between Petersburg and Milledgeville. And there's another individual who I'll present later on, that might provide a clue to some connections between San Francisco and the South. So then Newton St. John and Maria Jane Pope marry, actually in Petersburg, but return to reside in Mobile. And so at some point, then Mrs. Fisher arrives in Mobile. Now, what does that tell us? So she says upwards of 35 years in the art of cooking. That would mean that when she published her book, she's about 50 or 52 years of age, and that 35 years would have meant that she entered cooking right about 1846, 45, or 46. So Newton St. John and Maria Pope married in 1835. So at that time, Mrs. Fisher would have only been 3 years old. So it's a guess, but perhaps Alexander Pope, as a wedding gift, perhaps transferred Mrs. Fisher and her mother to Newton St. John and Maria as a wedding gift. And that may be, and again, it's a complete guess, but it seems logically to make some sense to, it seems to be how we can explain how she got from South Carolina to Alabama. Now, when she starts cooking in 1846, she is by that time 15 years old. So she's been living in Mobile, an urban center now, for at least 12 years. And so she would have started her work in an urban kitchen, not a plantation. And of course, at 15, when she says she started, her career in cooking, probably doing major tasks in the kitchen, she had probably been exposed to the kitchen by her mother doing smaller tasks that were suitable for small children. Um, so while she is working in an urban kitchen, it could be that her mother, who likely learned her culinary skills on a plantation, she may have transferred that culinary memory and oral history to Mrs. Fisher, which then emerges in her book and caused Karen Hess to assume or presume that Mrs. Fisher had been raised on a plantation. But I think it also explains when she talks about being raised, in the family of Newton St. John, it sounds like, it's a family network. She had clearly been there a long time if she is raised in the family. And so if she did enter that family at the age of 3, that would explain that particular comment. Now, in going through this research, I've been equally surprised by what I have found about her husband, Alexander C. Fisher. And so we have to talk about him a little bit as well. He, in 1871, is listed as a pastor at State Street Methodist Church, which is an African Methodist Episcopal Zion or AME Zion Church in Mobile. It's still there today. I'm not sure how active it is, but the building is still present. And he's actually working with Wilbur Strong to establish the AME Zion Church throughout the South. And he's making multiple trips between Pensacola, Florida, and Mobile. It's about a 60-mile distance between the two. He's working with Wilbur at each of the regional AME Zion conferences they have annually. He's serving as secretary, which speaks to his writing and reading skills, even though Mrs. Fisher had said, he didn't have the advantage of an education. That may be true. As a slave, they were denied education. But at some point along the way, someone taught him how to read and write. And concurrently, while he's working as a pastor, he's also working at the customs house as a customs inspector in Pensacola, Florida. And this is a picture of the customs house here. And he's working for a gentleman named Hiram Potter. So Hiram Potter was not well liked by everyone. I think Alexander and his colleagues respected Hiram Potter, but among the Republican Party in Florida that I've been able to tease out so far, there was a lot of divisiveness. And so there were some Republicans who did not want Hiram Potter to be in charge of customs in Pensacola. So what is probably the most surprising aspect of this particular research is what happens next. So Hiram Potter is under threat from his opponents to, like they want to get him out of office. So we suddenly find Alexander Fisher interacting with President Ulysses S. Grant. This was a jaw-dropping discovery. And in June of 1871, a Florida representative writes a note to President Grant saying, "This will be handed to you by Reverend A.C. Fisher, who has confidence and respect of a large majority of the Republicans of Escambia County. Be so kind as to listen to Mr. Fisher's story, and you will confer great favor." Now, this is all about saving Hiram Potter's job. And in the interim, I haven't shown it here, but there is another telegram that goes to Grant that says, don't trust Alexander Fisher. He's not really a resident of Escambia County. He's from Alabama. During this time, Alexander had also, by one account, been elected a county commissioner in Escambia County, though I haven't been able to confirm that. But there were just as many people against Hiram Alexander as there were Hiram Potter. So, in response to that, then, in a personal telegram by Alexander that he sends to President Grant. So, let me step back a point. This handing the telegram to President Grant. President Grant, I looked to see, was he like traveling in the Southeast at that time? Did he happen to be in the area? No, he was at the White House. So Alexander traveled to Washington, D.C. and personally delivered his story to President Grant at the White House. I haven't found the evidence to confirm that, but there's no other way that that information could have been transmitted. And this is all out of the Grant papers, all of the papers of Ulysses S. Grant. So in August, a couple of months later, Alexander sends a telegram to President Grant, says a colored man named Harriet has left Pensacola for Washington, supposedly with bogus papers against Collector Potter. There have been no public meetings nor legal petition here as yet, and please take no notice of him till you hear from me. And unfortunately, the paper trail stops there. There's no further mention that I've been able to find in the Grant papers. But this is just a remarkable, again, it just shows the connections that the Fishers had through Newton St. John. It's really, really remarkable that, none of this comes through in her preface of her cookbook. So what were they facing then by 1876? This is now about 10 years after the end of the Civil War. African Americans have made great strides in the South and gaining political power and office and being accepted into society. But there were still those who were completely opposed to Reconstruction. And they continued to fight their Civil War after the official Civil War ended. And I just recently finished doing a family history for a friend of mine. And it turned out that one of her descendants, one of her ancestors, I think her second great grandfather, was actually a gentleman named Captain James M. Parchman. And he was famous for establishing the Parchman Prison Farm in Mississippi he had modeled after an antebellum plantation. And it mainly housed African American prisoners. And it was 2,500 acres of land. And these prisoners were basically working in the fields just as if they were slaves. So in her papers that my friend shared with me, was a news clipping that didn't include any information about where it came from. I haven't been able to find the source, but I think it really shows what the Fishers and other African Americans were facing in the South at the time. And it's upon the death of Captain Parchman that a friend writes a tribute to him in the newspaper. And in addition to saying how, Captain Parchman was an honest man, he was a good man, he was a kind man, he goes on to say how they continued to fight Reconstruction. And he says, the days and years immediately succeeding the termination of the Civil War were fraught with much concern to our Southern people. In those stirring times, our line of action was the same: From 67 to 75, we were aligned in continuous warfare waged for political liberty in Mississippi. To resist the tyranny of the federal government and its unjust actions was the purpose of the Southern people. This accomplished the fight for white supremacy, resulting finally in our political deliverance in 1876 in this great political drama. This was happening across the South. It was the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. It was a very violent time and a very dangerous time for any African American living in the South, or anyone who supported them, any white person who supported them. And so we find in 1876 that the Fishers leave Alabama. Now, they had owned a home in Mobile. They sold it at that time in September 1876 for $500, which would be about $15,000 today. Alexander had been making an income through the customs house of about $1,000 a year, works out to about $35,000 a year today, in addition to whatever wages he received from the AME Zion Church. So when thinking about Karen Hess surmising that perhaps they had come west by wagon train, probably not the case. This is like 8 years, 7 years after the Transcontinental Railroad had been completed. The wagon trains had pretty much disappeared by that time. And it's more likely, also given that Newton St. John was heavily involved in the rail business, that they would have been more likely to take trains west. So here we see the route of the Mobile in Ohio as it makes its way to Columbus, Kentucky, and there, and Columbia, Kentucky, excuse me, and there the riders would transfer by ferry across the Mississippi River to Missouri. Now, we know that the Fishers were in Missouri in January 1877 because their last daughter, Matilda or Tilly, she is noted in census records as having been born in Missouri in January 1877. So we know that they're traveling in the dead of winter. And also, what else might have propelled them to come west? I mean, they could have gone anywhere. They could have gone north, they could have gone to Chicago, but they come to San Francisco. And it appears that Wilbur Strong may have encouraged Alexander Fisher to come west to spread the gospel of the AME Zion Church and to, help establish that church's presence in California. So there's a lot of reasons that may have been driving, their immigration into California at this time. Now, once they got to Missouri, they could catch additional routes that would take them up to St. Louis and make connections there to go west. And there were some railroads who were actively advertising to African Americans at this time. They may have been, subjugated to sitting in a car only for African Americans. But they did have access to rail, and the Fishers, bringing all of their family with them, certainly had the funds for that. So they arrive in San Francisco in early 1877, and her first business in San Francisco that I've been able to find appeared, an ad appeared in the Chronicle in May of 1877, in which she's advertising all kinds of Southern cooking, dinners, suppers, lunches, at or from home or short notice, preserved sweetmeats and pickles put up at your houses, charges moderate. So she was definitely charging, for a more upscale community. Now, the location is 1304 California Street. So here I show mansions on Nob Hill that had just been built when they arrived on California Street. And her business is actually only 1 block west of the Crocker Mansion. And it's the site of the Crocker Mansion was located at today's Grace Cathedral. So if you're on California Street, you're headed west, go 1 block. That's where she was doing business. So she was catering to the big four and all of the other wealthy folks that were living in Nob Hill at this time. Then she begins her pickle business initially in 1879, and her first ad appeared just before the California State Fair had opened. And the earliest ad I have found so far actually appeared in Fresno in August of 1879. She claims that, she's got the purest homemade pickles and preserves of all kinds put up in the good old Southern style and a liberal discount to the trade. And she's located at 569 Howard Street, which today is south of Market Street at about 2nd and Howard. And over that next couple of years, she's advertising as far away as Seattle, over to Logan, Utah, up and down California. And a lot of these places are farmland because at first I was puzzled. Why would, she's selling her pickles and preserves here in San Francisco. But I realized a lot of these areas were very agricultural areas. These are the locations where she would get a lot of the vegetables and fruits that she would need to make um, her the foods that she was putting up for sale. That's the only thing I can figure with that very wide distribution. She definitely had a marketing plan, that's for sure. Um, and she's listed in the 1880 directory as Alexander as the pickle and preserve manufacturer, and she is the cook, which at least in this year, and this is the only year this appeared, he was doing the business while she was, putting all the foods together for sale. Now, this is an image of Howard and 2nd Streets about 1906. This is about 25 years after they had a business there. But just to give you a flavor of what the region looked like, here we've got some rail under construction. Her business would actually have been just off the right side of this image, but it gives you an idea of what the community may have looked like. And then this image is actually from the time of the earthquake and fire. And if I can zoom in here, hopefully this will work. You can see actually the flames are approaching. So this is Howard Street. And what is right here would be 2nd Street. I believe, and it's hard to say, but based on Sanborn fire insurance maps, when the Fishers occupied the Howard Street location, there's an alley here, and they were actually living in a residence across from the main building where they had their storefront. So again, their storefront would have been right off the edge of the picture here on 2nd Street. But they were living on Howard Street, if I'm correct. But you can see here the fire, there's flames coming. People are, going about their business, trying to pack things as they go. This gentleman has, got his very expensive paintings that he's removing. Nobody's in a real big hurry, but, clearly the fire is coming. But those are the closest glimpses that we can get that I have found so far of 2nd and Howard Streets, of how it may have appeared when the Fishers were there. Then in 1880, we have the San Francisco Mechanics Fair. This is actually an image of the fair taken by Carlton Watkins, the famous San Francisco photographer. And perhaps we can zoom in here as well, take a closer look at some of these displays. Now, this is exactly, what Mrs. Fisher was setting up. It's hard to tell. Looks like maybe, well, it's hard to tell, what types of products are here because it's just too pixelated. But you can see there's several levels here to the building. But this is the area where she and Alexander would have set up her displays. or what it looked like. May not have been this particular room. And for the 1880 fair, she's listed as having won the silver medal in jellies and preserves and a bronze medal in pickles and sauces. And then she also received a premium for an assortment of jellies and preserves. So then in 1881, she has left Second and Howard. At least the storefront has left Second and Howard. I have a feeling that the pickle manufactory was still on Second and Howard, but now she's moved to DuPont Street, which, as I mentioned earlier, is Grant Street today. Today, that is in the main shopping district of San Francisco, which it was back then as well. So she's working as the pickle manufacturer, and Alexander is working for as a porter for Miles and King, who were stockbrokers at the time. So this is the time then that she's about to publish her book. And so the San Francisco Mechanics Fair, it was a big thing. There was the state fair in Sacramento, but the Mechanics Fair in San Francisco was right up there in terms of prominence, in terms of displays and exhibitions. And so the exhibitors in this year were asked to describe, what they were presenting. And I believe that Mrs. Fisher and her husband Alexander probably wrote this themselves. That, her preserves, jams, and sauces are all made by herself, that she's a colored woman from the South who, by energy and business tact, has built up a large and remunerative business in the preparation of articles of which she alone has the receipt, the recipe. So these are all proprietary recipes. Her pickles and sauces have a piquancy and flavor seldom equaled, and when once tasted, not soon forgotten. And I'll add here that a couple of years ago, Bay Area culinary historians put together a dinner of Abby Fisher recipes. And when you look through her book, there's so many things to choose from. And, how do you put that all together? And I attended, and what most amazed me was the fusion of flavors. It was incredible that, a sauce that another member had prepared went over the meat that I had prepared. It was like, oh my gosh, this is outstanding. So you can just imagine, it really gave you a feel for just that exhilaration of experiencing her cooking. So her book is on sale, and it's, quote, selling like hotcakes, which I love that quote. Her Southern cookery book, selling like hotcakes at the fair, and can also be purchased at her headquarters at her storefront at 202 DuPont Street. Interestingly, that year she didn't win any awards, which I find very suspicious, that she wasn't awarded one. But that same year, she also went over to the California State Fair. I haven't found any reports of awards given for anyone. And then she went down to the Stockton Agricultural Fair, and her pickles won second place. But her cookbook is, flying off the shelves. And another place her book was being sold was also the Goldberg Bowen and Company. Now, this was a pioneer company founded by Louis Liebenbaum and Jacob Goldberg, established in 1850. Went through many iterations of ownership. They were located downtown. They closed, the final iteration closed right about 1960. And even Herb Caen made mention of what are we going to do without them, because they were so beloved. And, they were definitely the go-to for groceries. But they were dealers in 1881 of choice family groceries, teas, wines, and importers of French, English, and German table delicacies. Now, Mrs. Fisher is selling her book and probably her pickles and preserves at Goldberg, Bowen and Company. And I say that because there is one book that I've seen that there is embossed inside the front cover that this book was purchased at Goldberg, Bowen and Company. So the grocer had locations very close to her location on DuPont Street, just this one only about a block away. So she definitely, is downtown where the upper echelon of San Francisco society is purchasing their products. Now, I mentioned earlier, Milledgeville. And so there's an interesting connection here that I haven't quite teased out all the way. But going back to Alexander, while Mrs. Fisher is achieving success in San Francisco, Alexander, when they first arrive, one of his first jobs is a messenger for the mayor of San Francisco, A.J. Bryant. You move to San Francisco and you work for the mayor. How does that happen? No matter who you are. And then in 1882-85, he is working as a porter for Mayor Washington Bartlett, who would later be the governor of California. Here's Washington Bartlett. He was born and raised in Milledgeville, Georgia. So it could be that there may be a connection between the Pope Bibb families who were frequenting Milledgeville for political purposes and the Bartlett family. I don't know. It just is a very, very interesting coincidence. Particularly that, Alexander would be employed by Mayor Bartlett. Then in 1887, Bartlett dies in office as governor, and there's a huge funeral in San Francisco attended by what was stated to be 10,000 people. And this is the first time I actually found an article about Alexander. And the article describes that he was walking behind Bartlett's casket during his funeral procession with another Bartlett servant. And alongside him were George Hearst and Levi Strauss. I keep looking for an image of that particular funeral procession. There must be one buried in the archives, probably in the state archives somewhere. I just think it would be so interesting to find that picture and to be able to point out Alexander in that procession in such a prominent place. So I have given birth to 11 children and raised them all. So what we find about the Fisher family is that Alexander Fisher Jr. Was born in 1867. Now, according to census records, Abby and Alexander were married in Mobile in 1860. I mentioned earlier that Alexander said he married an Abby Clifton, and that became, Abby Fisher. Unfortunately, after 1870, there's no further mention of Alexander Jr., so he must have died as a toddler in Mobile. Then in 1864, Benjamin T. Fisher was born. And then a daughter, Eliza Jane, born in 1868, Jenny, born in 1870, all born in Mobile. And then, as I mentioned, Mary Matilda, or who would be known as Tilly or Maddie, was born in Missouri in January 1877. Now, by the 1900 federal census, Alexander is stated to be 66. So that means he was born about 1834. Abby is stated to be 68, so she would have been born about 1832. And she also states in the census record that she had 8 children. Now, this is not the 11 that she mentioned in the book. And by this time, by 1900, 3 were still living. Now, a lot of times, anyone who's done genealogical work, it gets very frustrating because you go decade to decade and you'll find completely different information, different ages, different races, different birthplaces. And it's very, very frustrating. And it could be that perhaps Mrs. Fisher was not home in 1900 when this was taken, and someone else answered for her, perhaps one of the children, and guessed. We just don't know. But, if Mrs. Fisher said she had 11, we can only assume that there would have been a few children born prior to 1860 before her marriage to Alexander. And we don't know and may never know whether that was due to marriage or whether she was had to suffer some atrocity to have those children. That's just information that is forever lost. So as we continue on now, the book has been published. She continues her business as a professional cook. She's a caterer, giving lessons in cookery in 1885. But then in 1886, her 17-year-old daughter passed away, Eliza Jane. And I think this was perhaps a reason why Mrs. Fisher, who had likely been teaching her daughter the art of cooking, just like her mother had taught her. And she probably thought that these skills, Eliza Jane, would carry them forward. And now Eliza Jane has passed away. And I find that her activities in business really start to wane after that. But they are still, the Fishers are still periodically mentioned in the press. Here in 1889, they had attended a concert by opera singer Flora Batson, who is shown here, famously known as the double-voiced queen of song because she could go from soprano to baritone. And the article mentions that, the Fishers, along with several others, that all prominent colored people of the city were present. So by 1889, they are still in the forefront of society in the African American community in San Francisco. 1890 is the last year that I find that her pickles and preserves business is listed. And then it's noted in the 1890 federal census that was taken in San Francisco, several African American families, including the Fishers, were not counted. They just were skipped. And so this particular article notes that the 1890 census was a complete fail, which is interesting because nearly the entirety of the 1890 federal census is destroyed in a fire a few years later. So for all genealogists in the United States, that's a huge gap in research to not have that 1890 census, but the Fishers wouldn't have been in it. Then in 1891, they purchased a home in Noe Valley, that neighborhood just over the hill from me, on 27th Street between Church and Sanchez. And I just find it ironic that, she had lived on Church Street in Mobile, and now she's just up the street from the intersection with Church Street in San Francisco. This is the picture of the house in 1945. It looks a bit different today. It's still there. From what I understand, it's been heavily renovated on the interior, but the exterior looks relatively similar. In 1891, in that year, they purchased the home, and Alexander retires from City Hall. But then in 92, he and his son are working again as janitors at the Academy of Science, which was downtown at the time. And a lot of these positions, I'll add, when he is a messenger or a porter for the mayor, or they're working as janitors at the Academy of Science, these were appointed positions. These are not just something you saw in the classified ads in the newspaper. You had to be appointed to get these positions. So they were definitely still sought after for these kinds of jobs because of the respect that was held for them. So it has really you can't describe today's employment in those roles in the same way that you could back in 1892. Now, something interesting I came across as well. She had some charitable activities, and she was first, I find her in 1885, she's been elected conductor of the Aurora Lodge of the Knights and Ladies of Honor. Now, when this organization was founded in Kentucky, it was whites only, but soon after they recognized that, quote, of one flesh all are created. And this was a charitable organization that, looked after women in the city, the folks who were downtrodden, the orphans, and the like. Um, but even more interesting is from about 1884 to 1897, she was a member of the Grand Army of the Republic Lincoln Relief Corps, the Women's Relief Corps here in San Francisco, of which there were several chapters. And to be a member of the Grand Army of the Republic, the husband needed to have experience in the Civil War for the Union side. Now, that raises the question during Alexander and Abby's time in Mobile and Pensacola, during the Civil War and immediately after, were they spies? I mean, I can't imagine what else that could have been at that time. It might be impossible to find out, but there is some relationship between Alexander's activities in the South during the Civil War and being able to merit membership in the Grand Army of the Republic. Now, they were Union veterans of the Civil War. They say the veterans of the late unpleasantness. In these decades after the Civil War, everybody's trying to come back together. Nobody wants to upset the other side. Nobody would say slavery. Nobody would say, the Civil War or secession. But, I think the veterans of the late unpleasantness says a lot about how they were really doing a lot of wordsmithing to avoid upsetting what had previously been their opponents. And also, the Grand Army of the Republic, from its founding, was a diverse organization, so it accepted African Americans from the get-go. Now, I've contacted the Grand Army of the Republic Museum in Philadelphia about, locating records of the GAR in San Francisco. He told me there weren't any, that the records were destroyed in the 1906 earthquake and fire. I've had one other person tell me there are records, but since she told me that, I haven't been able to get in contact with her. So I'm still hoping to find more information of that it might shed light on, what was the activity that gave Alexander and therefore Abby the ability to join the Grand Army of the Republic. So towards the turn of the 20th century, they enter a more private life, and they're mentioned one last time in society pages. And it says, last Sunday, Mr. and Mrs. Fisher gave a breakfast party at their home on 27th Street in honor of James T. Peterson of Mobile. After enjoying an elaborate repast, so we can only imagine what that breakfast must have been with Mrs. Fisher cooking, the daughters, Jenny and Maddie, and their son, or their brother, Benjamin, entertained the company with vocal and instrumental selections. So it gives you an idea of the dynamics of their family. Clearly, they were very musical. Clearly, they enjoyed cooking. And as far as Mr. James T. Peterson, it's hard to see in this print. Let me zoom it up a little bit here. But he's noted in the Southern Watchman in May of 1901, so a couple of years after this article appeared, that he was the wealthiest Negro in Mobile and perhaps the state. So it could be that the Fishers were acquainted with him. He looks younger than the Fishers would have been at this time, so perhaps he was a child when they were living in Mobile. He was a businessman, a merchant. At one point, he became a dentist. And by 1906, he's associated with Booker T. Washington. So this was a very prominent individual in Mobile that just happened to drop in for a visit in San Francisco in 1897. So the memories of a Noe Valley neighbor, when we look at the Fisher House here on 27th, this is Sanchez. Church Street would be way further down here. They had a neighbor, kind of kitty corner from them across the backyard. And when this neighbor was introduced to me, I gave him a call. He was an older man, still living in this same house in 2021 or so that he had grown up in as a boy. And he recalls, and this would have been when he was 14 years old, so right around 1950. He recalls Tilly, the youngest daughter, who by that time is the only one remaining at the house. And he told me that she was a very nice lady. She had a very large backyard with flowers and vegetables. So you can only imagine that Mrs. Fisher had started that garden reminiscent of that big space she had in Mobile. She worked downtown at Tilly worked downtown at the Curran Theater as a matron, and he called her a real lady. When she went out, she wore the hats and gloves. And he recalls his mother, um, talking across the backyard so that from his mother's kitchen window, somehow could see Tilly over in the yard, and they would chat back and forth almost on a daily basis. And I asked him, did he remember her sharing recipes with his mother or talking about recipes? And unfortunately, he didn't recall any of that. But again, it just gives you a little bit of a feel of the type of people, the good people that the Fishers were. So in the 20th century, 1910, Benjamin, Jenny, and Tilly continued living with the parents. Benjamin was married, had a very ugly divorce that was in the paper. Jenny had a boyfriend. She's in and out of residence on 27th Street. Tilly continued living almost continuously at the house. And on January 9th, 1915, Mrs. Fisher passed away. Here it said she was 87. She was born in 1828. Again, 1828, 1832. We just don't know exactly. And then about 7 years later, Alexander passed away at the age of 82, claiming he had been born in 1840. And he had actually spent the last 5 years in a relief home for the infirmed and aged. So this is a map of Cypress Lawn Cemetery down in Colma. And for those of you who aren't familiar or may not be from the area, San Francisco used to have all its cemeteries in San Francisco. And towards the end of the 20th century, as the population continued to expand and they wanted to build additional neighborhoods all the way to the ocean, at some point the cemeteries had to go. And so over those years, and particularly right about the start of World War II, is when everybody had to be moved to Colma, which is this little community just across the county line that, it broadcasts and has 450 living residents and 1 million deceased residents. So all the cemeteries are down there in Colma. And so, based on Cypress Lawn cemetery records, the Fishers are buried just inside the eastern entrance to Cypress Lawn. Interestingly, right next to the Lily Hitchcock Coit Mausoleum. So you go up, you come in from Hillside, you make your first right and your first right, and it's a cul-de-sac. And in the center of this cul-de-sac is this large mausoleum that actually says Hitchcock. Well, that ended up being Lily Hitchcock Coit, who, for those of you maybe not in San Francisco, that is the giant tower that looks like a fire hose that's near North Beach on the north end of the San Francisco Peninsula. Uh, Presumably because she so much loved firefighters because she had been saved from a fire as a child. Others say no, it's just by accident that the tower looks like that. But anyway, that's who Lily Hitchcock Coit is. And the Fishers are buried just adjacent to that. And they are buried in unmarked graves. So this is the area based on a map that Cypress Lawn provides of where the Fishers are buried. And there's a total of 3 unmarked graves. There's 2 here. And then about a mile to the southwest, Cypress Lawn is massive. A mile to the southwest is a 3rd unmarked grave. So the children then pass away, Benjamin in 1926, Jenny in 38, and then Tilly in 1954 at the age of 77. And each of them is doubled up. Tilly, I believe, is buried with her mother. Jenny is buried with her father. And then Benjamin is buried with a friend of his, or a brother-in-law or something. I can't quite remember what the relationship is, in the 3rd location a mile away. So why are the graves unmarked? It's a great question. I am trying to find that out. Is it because of funding? Is it because of choice? Or are there other reasons that perhaps their graves are unmarked? Sadly, Eliza Jane, who had died in 1886 and buried in San Francisco, is missing. When folks were told to leave San Francisco, it was basically the city would move the monuments and markers, but the family had to pay to actually exhume the coffins and take them down to Colma. And so it's believed there's probably still many, many people still buried in San Francisco that we don't know of. And sadly, they must not have known where Eliza Jane was, in order to bring her to Colma as well. So that is some of what I've been able to discover about Mrs. Fisher. There's still several other items I wish I had had the time to include today. But thank you very much for listening.